As a woman on the internet with opinions who's been harassed pretty much nonstop for the past 5 or 6 years by men who tell me that I should be raped or killed in some horrific manner, I've had ample opportunity to study the sort of men who send these messages. And what I've found each time that I've dug into the history of a person who sends me that sort of harassment, I've found that every single time they turn out to be gigantic losers. This, of course, is an anecdote. It's just my own experience, and it may be heavily biased by my own background, my own past experiences. Maybe if someone were to do a scientific study on every single person who sends me those sort of messages, they would find many of them who don't live in their parents' basements or do have fulfilling sexual lives or haven't been convicted of sexual assault. No one has offered to do that study yet, but 2 researchers have just published a study in PLOS One revealing that they've found that men who harass women in online games are, in the most literal sense possible, gigantic losers. The problem here is that whenever I find a study that fits so perfectly with what I want to be true, I know I have to work a little bit harder to examine all of its flaws because that's what a good skeptic does. You criticize the things you love. This study specifically looked at gamers who play Halo 3 for Xbox 360, specifically a mini-game within that game, which is a player versus player game that pits 8 people against each other in teams of 4. The researchers played the game 163 times, saying that they eventually had to stop just because of the time investment. Excuse me while I shed a single tear for these poor researchers. Meanwhile, there are other scientists out there who are on day 472 of watching a spore grow. And I don't mean spore as in the video game, I mean an actual spore. For each game, the researchers played neutral pre-recorded messages that were in either a male voice or a female voice. These included things like, "I like this map," played at the beginning of the game, or "Good game, everyone," played at the end. Apparently, "Die in a fire, you fucking camper," was not considered neutral, despite the fact that on Xbox 360 it seems to be pretty neutral. They recorded each of the games, had transcripts made, and then had coders go through each statement made on voice chat and tag them as either positive, like "good game," negative, like "die in a fire," I guess, or neutral, like "AFK, mom just brought down pizza rolls." Then they logged the statistics for each person who spoke on voice chat, including their gender and their KDR, their kill-death ratio, or how many times they killed one of the other players compared to how many times they themselves died. The researchers say that they found that the worse men did in the game, the worse they tended to treat the female experimental player. But with the male experimental player, the worse men did, the more subservient they tended to be toward him. There's a chart in the study that's reproduced in outlets like the Washington Post that's pretty damning. The solid line shows that the more skill the male players have, the more compliments they gave the female experimental player. The dotted line shows that they didn't really change the number of compliments that they gave the male experimental player. The problem with this chart is that it doesn't show data. It shows a statistical analysis based on the data. My good friend, astrophysicist Katie Mack, plotted the actual data on a graph so you could see what it really looks like. And as you can see, it's a lot messier than the statistical analysis makes it look. There are a whole lot of outliers, and it becomes a lot more difficult to see any kind of trend. It really all depends on what kind of statistical analysis you're running on this data. And not even all of the massaged and refined models show what the headlines claim that they should show. For instance, this graph shows that the more times a player dies, the more likely he is to throw insults at both the male and the female experimental player. The female tends to get a few more insults at the lower end, but then the more times the player dies, the worse he is, the more he starts to insult the male player. The other problem with the study is that they didn't get enough data to evaluate the use of sexualized insults. They found that 13% of the people who spoke on mic did use hostile sexist statements, but that still wasn't enough data for them to find any significant correlations. So at the end of the day, are men who harass women in online games losers? Absolutely. But are they necessarily bad at games? This research unfortunately doesn't give us enough data to tell. We're going to need a lot more research. And so if any researchers are out there and they need some help playing some games, I volunteer as tribute.